Hi, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. You have braved the rain, and I want to dispel rumours that I brought it with me just before we start. I know that the English are famous for their rain, but this one's not on me, just for once. How are you all? Yeah, good. I'm so honoured and delighted to be invited back. I came here 2 years ago and didn't know what to expect. Everyone explained this place to me in advance, and I was like, what? So it's a holiday camp for grown-ups. That was the sort of best, which I'm still not entirely dispelled of that impression, really. That's what you're doing here, isn't it? But I had such a warm welcome then, and when I was invited back, I was absolutely thrilled, because it would mean that I haven't misbehaved myself too badly in my time here. And I don't think we have the equivalent to this in the UK. I don't think we have quite the same thing. And this commitment you're all showing by standing in the rain, thank you. But this commitment to coming together to talk and to think about places where otherwise we might differ, and which otherwise might cause conflict. I think it's so special. And maybe it's good to jog your memory about how special this is, because I don't think we have this kind of dialogue in the UK. And that really lands me squarely in what I want to talk about today, which on the face of it is about why awe matters. I hope you've been persuaded of that all this week already. You've had some extraordinary speakers. But beneath that is why we are so desperately in need of something to heal us and to bring us together in this moment. And how something that might seem as sort of soft and silly and nice to have as awe, that might seem like a kind of addition to life rather than one of the crucial central parts of it, for me is something that might just rescue us if we can re-engage with it, but re-engage with it in a serious, committed way. This is, unfortunately, going to lead us into thinking a bit about how we structure our lives around awe rather than just wait for it to come. But I'll get there. The last time I was here, I was in a really different state of mind. We were 2 years into the pandemic era, and I don't know how many of you will recognise this, but I'd felt profoundly changed by it. And not necessarily in a good way, I have to tell you. I'd felt that there was a kind of barrier between me and the outside world, that it felt harder to get out again, even though I wanted to, that my habits had been broken of just going for a walk every day, just that simple gesture of going out and getting a cup of coffee. That suddenly seemed really hard. It was no longer dangerous to do that, but there was an invisible barrier for me that I couldn't have explained to you then, and I can't fully explain to you now. There was this kind of change of habit. And I tried to describe that at the beginning of Enchantment, this kind of sense of dislocation with the world. And I talked about it in terms of this habit of fear that we've all got into. I described it as running like rabbits. We glimpse a flash of white tail, read the danger signal and run, flashing our own white tail behind us. It's a chain reaction, a river of terror surging incoherently onwards, gathering up other wild, alert bodies who in turn signal their own danger. We are in the business of running now. So this, for me, was the way I wanted to describe this kind of chain reaction going on, of the way we came to fear each other, the outside world, but also this deep mistrust of other people. I have to tell you that whenever I speak to Americans from England, they always say, oh, it's bad here, it's terrible here. And whenever I come, I meet delightful human beings, utterly delightful. And I know that we in the UK do exactly the same thing. The goodness of the places we live in are often so invisible to us, and we have become afraid. And we've become afraid of a kind of spiraling, a kind of snowball effect that we think might just happen. And we've become afraid of how deep our differences feel. I describe it in the book as a deep bone tiredness of people who no longer feel at home. And what do I say about that? Because I feel it too. I feel like something has become unstable in us. And it's so pertinent to be here today talking about this, because those of you that follow international news will have seen a lot of fairly grim news from my own country this week. And everyone's been asking me about it, and I'm going to weigh in just for a few moments about that, because actually I think there's a lot to say and a lot that speaks to my topic today. So for those of you that don't know, just over a week ago, there was a horrific murder of 3 little girls. It's important to say their names because their names have been obliterated in the chaos that's followed. They are Alice Aguiar, B.B. King, and Elsie Stankham. They were attending a Taylor Swift-themed dance class, delightful, dance and yoga, and a young man, only 17 years old himself, came in with a knife, killed 3 children, injured others, and the adults who did everything to protect them. Oh, you guys are used to this kind of story, right? We are, one of the first things that we say in England is thank God we don't have guns when that kind of thing happens. But it's devastating. And it speaks to the anomie and the dislocation that young man was feeling. I grieve for him as well. But in the aftermath, online agitators, some of them who own Twitter, began to spread rumours that this was the work of a recent immigrant. Yeah. Everyone's like, oh, not this again, because we know this story, right? It turned out not to be true, and of course, even if it had been true, what followed would not have been okay, which was that far-right agitators began to plan to riot in different cities in the country. The promised riots were fortunately never as bad as they were made out to be. And in truth, very few people turned up to do this kind of harm that so many people were shouting so loudly about on the internet. There's a lot of very brave people on the internet who become a lot less brave in person. And for once, we can be very grateful for that. But people were harmed. Mosques were set fire to or attempted to. Immigration centres had bricks thrown at them. Police officers were harmed. Community centres damaged. And it's a story that's only too familiar. I want to talk about how we can heal that kind of division today, but first of all, I want to bring up the first instance of awe in this talk, because two things gave me that feeling that we'll all recognise of life suddenly going from awful to absolutely extraordinary in the wake of that. One was that on Saturday, in a borough of London, a planned far-right protest, I'm going to lean heavily on inverted commas there because that's their word for it, I would call it thuggery, drew 6 far-right agitators and 10,000 anti-racists coming to defend the community. We like that. The second that I think loads of you will really love is in the course of one of the very first riots. A library called Spellow Lane Library in Liverpool was damaged. And the librarian went straight online and set up. This is in a poor area. This is not the kind of community that can easily repair a library. So she set up a crowdfunder, asking to raise £500 to repair the damage. I just checked this morning, and so far it's raised £225,000. People rushed to help, right? And it's really hard to notice that, because the people who are rushing to cause chaos and to destroy make so much noise, and they frighten us, and they cause the effect that I described when I talked about us running like rabbits. We hear about those 6 people who turned up in Tottenham, and we are terrified. And it is harder for us to notice the 10,000. And that's not to diminish the absolute horror that those 6 people are perfectly capable of causing. But it's to say that we can draw strength and we can draw awe from the will of people to turn up. And we can all learn to do better on that front. I just had to begin with that, because these things are circling around both of our societies and have been for so long now. And it is time we changed. Anyway, so so there is this sense that something has broken for us. There's this sense that a feeling of fellow humanity has gone. The sense that, that it's not just that we can't see the other side's perspective, but that we're both living in entirely different realities. This is sort of transcended disagreement. And in this tinderbox moment, when we are all so worried and horrified and frightened, I'm going to try and convince you that awe is important. That feels like quite a hard job, but I'm going to do my best. Because I do believe it's true. I do believe that it is essential for us as human beings. It's essential to our bodies. It is the root of our connection to each other. And it's the quality that allows us to see ourselves as part of a greater whole, rather than as just individuals. And it's also a mindset that helps us to cope at dark times. And yet at those dark times, that's when it's most easily lost. But I do think that in order to really embrace this as part of our normality, we need to come to quite a different understanding of awe, and to escape the very modern commodification of it, to learn how to practice it rather than to wait for it to happen. Before I start trying to persuade you of that, I just want to dig in a little to think about what awe means, because it is actually notoriously hard to define, and I know some of you will have listened to lots of different ways of thinking about it this week, but let's anchor ourselves there. It's something that's more than an emotion, right? It's a state of being. How many of you in this room feel that you have experienced awe? Okay. How many more than once? How many more than 3 times? Great. This is brilliant. I'm preaching to the converted. How many more than 10 times? Oh, you people, you're living good lives. This is great. So let's think about the kind of threads of awe. I'd love you to hold in your mind that feeling that came to you at that moment when it happened to you. I'd like you to think about where you were, and maybe later when we do the questions, if you don't want to ask a question, you could just tell me your moment of awe. I would so love to hear that. That would actually be very pleasurable. Awe, the idea of awe, contains a sense of vastness, a sense of ineffable power. It implies that the experience is somehow connected to greatness, whether that greatness is conceptual or physical. It tends to involve a sense of heightened reality, of flow, of being intensely in the moment with the subject of our awe. Nothing else matters when we're experiencing awe. And that's very interesting to me. We are immersed in beauty, and we feel this profound emotional connection to the moment that's unfolding before us, so much so that it lasts. That emotional connection to that moment doesn't go away. When I asked you if you'd experienced awe, you went straight to it, and you knew what it had done for you. But the meaning of awe has shifted over the centuries, and I think that in many ways we've allowed awe to lose its bite. We tend to, in current times, see it as experiencing something wonderful, something very beautiful, something gorgeous, overwhelmingly gorgeous. But we used to acknowledge a much more complex experience of awe, and that is a sense of enormity that borders on terror. This feeling that we might be overthrown is contained within the idea of awe. It's always been linked to incomprehension. We can't expect to understand it. It is unknowable. It leaves us dumbstruck. That might be the phrase that we use. We can't find words for it. And awe, the kind of defining experience of awe, is what you would feel if you looked into the face of God. This sense of an immensity in so many directions that is too great for the feeble human mind to comprehend. And maybe I shouldn't love this, but I love that we get the word awful from awe. Isn't that just great? Like we've taken the bite out of the word awful too, to only mean terrible. That's boring. Awful used to mean full of awe. Isn't that a fascinating shift that we've made? We've tamed both parts of that meaning. There's a lovely quote from a writer called Joseph Addison, writing in 1699, who visited the Alps. And he described them as filling the mind with an agreeable kind of horror. There's something in that definition, isn't there, that just really captures it. We find it pleasurable, but it's also horror. It's both. And we can't talk about awe, really, particularly awe in nature, and I often write about the natural world, even if it betrays me on certain days like this. We can't think about awe without thinking about the sublime, which is what Addison came to write about. The sublime is the idea of such grand, extreme beauty that it has a kind of obliterating quality about it. It could even evoke horror. And this comes from a time when we were just changing our relationship with the natural world, away from seeing it as a place outside of civilization, a place of kind of fundamental darkness and dangerousness, a place where only the most abject people were forced to work, and into a place we might want to visit in order to experience this quality of awe. We're much more used to wanting to visit now rather than seeing it as an impossible edifice to scale. And writing about half a century after Addison, Edmund Burke developed this idea of the sublime. He compared it to a flood of light or absolute darkness against mere beauty, which is soft lighting. It's everything blasting at us all at once, and it can even evoke horror. And he said that the defining experience of the sublime was negative pain. He said that's not the same as positive pleasure, but it's still delightful, but it's negative pain. I find it quite hard to conceptualize that. I don't know about you. And Schopenhauer agreed. He said that sublimity is profoundly violent, turbulent, potentially destructive. It always has to have this power to overcome us. And its ultimate expression is the immensity of the universe. Do you remember the first time someone told you that the universe was infinite? Do you remember that? I can feel how that landed in my body the first time I heard it. I couldn't process it. I still struggle now. I find it easier to think about the way that time runs forward. I can imagine that running forward forever. I don't find it so easy to think about space doing the same thing. That's another story. Let's not go there. So Awe is what we feel when we encounter the sublime. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples of times when I've felt awe in my life. One was really recent, actually. I travelled with my family in March to Japan, primarily because my son is obsessed with all things Japanese. And I thought, well, why not? Let's go, why not? And we toured around, we did the tour, and then we spent a week on the banks of a lake underneath Mount Fuji, a lake that was fed with meltwater from the mountain. And on the day we arrived, it was raining. It was very, very much like this. We wove through the foothills in a bus, and we dumped off in a completely unknown town and got very, very wet. And eventually arrived at this lovely apartment by the lake, sorry. I think everything's the sea. I'm always craving the sea. There's the sea over there, isn't there? Yeah, I thought so. I'm glad to be reassured. And looked out over the lake to where Fuji should be to see absolutely nothing at all, like nothing. And I said to my husband, like, well, the mountain's quite big, isn't it? Like, how can we not see it? I began to imagine in my mind that this mountain would be just small and very far away and easily hidden. The next morning, I woke up, didn't think at all about Fuji, made a cup of tea, pottered around, wrote in my notebook for a while, ran a bath. And then just as I was about to get into Japanese baths are incredible, by the way. If you ever get to go to Japan, take a bath. Like, that's all you need to do. They're vast. I put my head on to wash my hair, and I realised I was so deep, I sort of panicked that I was never going to come up again. So I just thought, I'm just going to see how the weather is out there. Open the curtains. And there was this mountain. And look, I'm speechless. What do you say? It was vast. It was so vast and grand and beautiful. It was pure black at the bottom and sort of striated. It's a volcano, it's a dormant volcano. Actually, I don't think it's entirely, anyway. And at the top, it was covered in this beautiful white cap of snow. It was the classic view of Fuji you've seen over and over and over again. And there it was, and it felt for a moment like it was pressed right up against my nose. I couldn't believe it. And I was so overcome by it that I literally ran around in circles in the living room for a while because I was trying to decide whether to wake up my husband to show him. And as I was running around in circles, he got up and was like, oh my God, the mountain. I was like, oh, you did want to see it then? I was in pieces. And for the next few days, I found that the clouds would cover Fuji completely, and then you'd get this kind of little peep show of it. You'd glimpse these little windows, and every time the gasp would come unbidden. It was magnificent. It's the spiritual centre of so much of Japanese culture, and to see it once is to completely understand why. So that's a very recent example. The other example was 20 years ago. And I, at the time, was a young teacher. And not being a lover of crowds, ever, I decided to join the protest march against the war in Iraq. I was really nervous about it. I'd never been on a protest march before. It felt beyond my experience, but I felt like I had to put my voice to this moment. And at the time, I was quite unwell. I've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and I was struggling to stay in work. I was spending all my spare time just lying down, resting. I was in a lot of pain. I was finding it hard to walk. But I needed to go. I caught the train up with my husband, and I knew that I couldn't handle waiting at the beginning to kind of go out in a pack. I couldn't handle sort of standing there for ages. And so I said to my husband, like, let's sort of try and slip in halfway through and see if people let us. They did. We joined the crowd and people welcomed us in. And I was suddenly hit by this extraordinary feeling of just how many people were there in one go. I can't explain it in any other way. It was like there was a cloud around them and I'd breathed in a hit of it. I could feel all those people there and feel their incredible goodwill, you know. This was a very peaceful crowd. They were singing and marching along and having a good time and hugging each other and being friendly and making jokes. But they were there because they cared about something very deeply, and I cared about it too. And I walked into the crowd and immediately burst into tears. It was that quick. And I looked at my husband and he had tears running down his face too. It took me years to understand that too was awe. Because this huge crowd of people could have overcome us if they didn't like us, if they turned against us for some reason. But the hugeness there was unquantifiable. And I later read that there were 1 million people there. That's how it felt to be amid 1 million people walking through the streets of London all together with a common purpose, a common peaceful purpose that was so important to me. There's my 2 incidences of awe. There have been others, but they're the ones that spring freely to mind. And it's no wonder that awe is something that we want to experience. We have a bit of a problem with it, though. It's hard to set up the circumstances for awe. We can try, we can go to the right places, but it can't be forced. It can be incredibly elusive. Sometimes you can travel to a grand part of the landscape and expect to get that hit that you so crave, and nothing comes. That's entirely possible. Even when we find it, it's incredibly fragile. It's ephemeral. It can pass very, very quickly. And we can rarely repeat it by doing the same thing again. There's an element of surprise to awe. For true awe to come, I think it has to creep up behind us a little bit. Oh, wow. This happened to me last time. I just want to say it. I don't know how many people it happens to, but last time I had thunder and lightning, and if I don't get that this time, I'm going to be disappointed, particularly talking about awe. Come on. No, never do that to the clouds. And I do think that there's 2 issues here. One is that we expect to be able to buy awe. We expect to be able to go on the right holiday that's just expensive enough and to purchase this encounter with the divine greatness that awe shows us. And that means that we often think that we have to travel far to see it. We assume that awe can't possibly be near us. It has to be far away. It has to be far too grand an experience to be found in our backyard. And so it becomes so rare to us. And I also think that we have become uncomfortable with those darker elements of awe. We only want one half of it. We only want the nice bit, the pretty bit, the really lovely bit, the bit that looks great on Instagram. And my goodness, my picture of Fuji looked great on Instagram, but it captured nothing of it. And I love this quote from Jung, who says, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Yeah, it's nice, isn't it? And I think one of the things we need to do is re-engage with the darkness that awe reveals to us. We need to feel that sense of existential terror again. And Dacher Keltner's work, how many of you saw Dacher Keltner earlier this week? Yeah, I had him on my podcast and he was just great. He was such a lovely, gentle presence in the world. Wow. Don't tell Dacher I did that. He'd be really nice about it, that's the problem. He talked about how awe is often experienced as a feeling of shift, this immediate change in perspective, this immediate knowledge that you have been changed. It works just like that. For me, I'd describe it as getting this sudden window on the true scale of the universe, this sense that you've kind of looked through something into something else. And the important thing here is that you perceive your smallness. I used to be so afraid of feeling small when I was a child. That's why I did not like the infinite universe, right? But actually, as an adult, I'm relieved by feeling small. It means I don't have to solve everything. It means I'm not the center of everything. I don't want to be at the center of everything. I like feeling not just small, but understanding my scale in the context of things, understanding where I sit. And Keltner's research shows that this has huge value when we do this, when we experience this shift. We are immediately more humble. We are measurably more compassionate to our fellow humans after that experience. We go back out in the world and we understand our scale, and therefore we are kinder. It also comes with a sense of purpose and calling quite often. I'm sure you've heard of the effect had on many of the astronauts who've looked down on the planet, called the overlook effect, which changes forever how they feel and often lets them return to Earth committed to making change and making good change and feeling like they can't avoid that change. And so awe is this mechanism that is built into us, which offers us a radical reframing of our place in the world and maybe even the universe. And our illusion of control is destroyed by it. We perceive our smallness, our weakness, our helplessness, and it changes us for good and forever. This is why I think everybody needs this moment of awe. This is why this incredibly soft emotion, this incredibly kind of glamorous lifestyle-y experience that we now buy as a holiday if we can, is something that I think we need to spread and share. And when I sat down to write Enchantment, I banged my head right up against that problem. Because the starting point of the book for me was roaming around the internet one day with no purpose, as I so often do, and reading an account of the 1833 Leonid meteor shower. For those of you that have never come across this, and I never had before, it happened on the night between the 12th and 13th of November. And an absolutely extraordinary meteor shower took place. I'm going to read you the excerpt from my book, because I spent ages getting this paragraph right, so I might as well share the description now. In the early hours of 13th of November, 1833, those who were awake shared an extraordinary sight. According to the New York Evening Post, it seemed that the Cape of Heaven was raining down a shower of fire, that's a contemporary quote, over the eastern states of America. Shooting stars came in such density that, and I quote, the whole firmament appeared to be in motion with them, as if the planets and constellations were falling from their places. In the time before electric light, night wakers were well used to seeing meteors scuttling across the heavens, but this was different. The black bowl of the sky was suddenly full of sparks, 1,000 at a time, all drawing silvery lines like the ribs of a celestial umbrella. Never before had anyone seen the sky's arc so clearly described. It was as though a curtain had been drawn back to reveal the truth known, but never really understood, that the earth is a ball floating through the vastness of space, and that we, its motion-sick citizens, are only ever spectators of this grand planetary drama. It gave me all the feels, right? And I didn't know what kind of book I wanted to write about at the time, but I knew that this had to be the center of it. It captured the essence of everything I wanted to say about this world, and it showed me what I personally craved. But then I began to wonder how I could write a book about this feeling. And my first instinct was, I need to go and climb a mountain. I don't have a head for heights. I have Meniere's disease, which makes heights really difficult for me because minute changes of pressure in my ear just send me sideways. Mountains are not good for me. And that meant my book stalled. I had this feeling that I had to capture something vast, and the most vast thing I could think of was a mountain, and I love to walk. And I thought, if I can't go to a mountain, then I can't write this book. I realise it was stupid in retrospect, but humour me for a moment. Writers get in these really weird corners of thought like this. It's just what we do. We spend too much time alone. So after a while, I got frustrated with that because I wanted to write about this, and I felt also like I deserved my awe. And it made me angry because why should awe only be accessible to the physically able, the people who are free to do as they please? I wrote a lot about being a carer in my book, and the people with financial resources. Nobody else had told me this. These were my ingrained beliefs. And I rebel against everything like that anyway. And I decided that I wanted to democratise awe. And then one night I was in my back garden, and I was looking up at the moon outside, and I realised that I could essentially see the same thing that the people in 1833 saw. I was looking out into the universe. I could see the moon, I could see the stars. They were all there waiting for me. And I experienced this shift in perspective that suddenly said to me that awe was something that I could choose. I didn't have to wait for it passively to happen. And that made me look a little deeper into my own environment. I noticed that the sea near me had tides every day that showed me the gravitational pull of the moon. That's amazing, isn't it? Isn't that just absolutely amazing to be able to watch that in real time? And I also spent some time just standing by the tide as it came in and seeing how high it would come above my head. That volume of water was something I found difficult to conceive. I've always collected stones, and I remember as a child being absolutely amazed by how old they could possibly be, and I returned to that thought. I returned to my fossil collection and tried to conceptualise how impossibly ancient they were. And this was awe. It's not the same awe as that big life-swerving sudden hit that almost knocks you off your feet. It's more diffuse and it's more subtle. I sometimes call it small awe as opposed to big awe. But I think we need both. It's kind of gentler strain, it's more akin to wonder. And I began to think about how it could be a practice and a method of living instead of something that we think we might get sometimes if we're lucky. And that's what I called enchantment, this commitment to perceiving the latent magic of the planet that we live on. And this kind of awe is like a muscle. Your capacity for it grows as you practice it. It's about, deliberately noticing, but it's also about building knowledge around the things that you're paying attention to. Awe can often come from applying science to what you're observing. It can come from understanding the mythology around it, the folklore of your local landscape. It can grow with spiritual wisdom. We don't have to experience this dichotomy of the soft and the hard. They both feed each other together. And that made me really understand for the first time in my life that our mythology and our folklore and the stories we grow with are there to remind us of the enormity of the mundane world, to keep us seeing that much bigger picture. Now, on one of my missions to try and conceptualise this idea, went to try and see a meteor storm of my own. And I travelled with my husband and son in the spring to see the Lyrids. I travelled to the Dark Skies Park of Exmoor in Devon, beautiful place. And we drove out late one night over onto the beautiful moors to try and watch for stars. When we got there, I realised that it was a supermoon. The sky was so bright with this incredible moon that nothing was visible. You couldn't see a single star. And I was so disappointed. I'd driven so far. And I wanted to write about it. I was like, this book is not cooperating with me. And as I was standing there cursing the universe and my foul luck, I noticed that my husband's shadow was being cast on the ground. And I said, have you left the car headlights on? There's no wonder I can't see a thing. The car headlights weren't on. The moon was so bright that it was casting a shadow. And I realised I'd seen a moon shadow. Isn't a moon shadow a lovely thing? I'd never seen a moon shadow before. And that taught me that you have to be open-minded about the awe you find. You don't necessarily get the stuff you're looking for. You accept your awe, you accept what you're given, you accept what you're offered, and that's part of the discipline of this. And if you don't find it, or if you only get the subtlest trace, you go back again and again, and you think about it. And you engage with your gut reaction of what fascinates you rather than what you've been told to be fascinated with. And you practice, and you deliberately spread it. I'm going to finish in just a moment because I hope you've got some questions for me or some experiences of awe, which you know I'd love to hear. But we have a responsibility to share this. We have a responsibility to practice in ourselves, to soothe ourselves, to help ourselves to cope through these times, and to stop ourselves from cutting off and feeling like this isn't for us anymore and that we can't do it. We've got greater responsibility than that. And we share it. We tell people about our awe. That's why I'm inviting you to do that today, because awe spreads. When we tell people about an instance of awe, we feel those tingles secondhand. I get them. I get them when people tell me their awe, and I know you will too. And this is why gathering matters. This is why being here together matters, because we can experience a different kind of contagion than the kind of contagion that we've been worrying about for so long. We can learn to practice deep listening again. Deep and pleasurable listening, incidentally. I want to leave you with a slight complication because awe does not have its own ethics. We need more than it. We need to think around it. But it does urge us to see complexity, which is so important, and to feel this compassion, and to be less certain of our own correctness, because we understand ourselves on human scale. And most of all, the sun's come out. We just need a rainbow now and everything's going to be okay forever. Most of all, it shows us not that we're separate from nature, but that we're part of it, that we're part of a continuum with nature. And that means that it's very hard to harm something that you're part of. Whether you're human or landscape or animal, we are connected to all of those things, and so we must take care of them. And we must get that habit back of feeling connection again. I'm going to stop there.